Hello and welcome to our podcast. I'm Dani, and today Great.com talks with Rachel Bukasa, the executive director of Black Sash. If you haven't heard of them yet, they are deeply committed to understanding and promoting social protection and social justice in South Africa. Before we begin, remember if you're new here to this podcast, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. Hi, Rachel, and welcome.
Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I think Black Sash has been doing such wonderful work for such long, long time that it's vital that if we talk about South African organizations, we talk about you guys. So let's begin. I usually do this. I like to learn more about history first. And in this case, I want to add, like, if you could tell us more about the origin of Black Sash, how did it all happen, and what are these foundational principles that guided it?
Sure. Yes. So, in fact, Black Sash is a very interesting history. South Africa, about 30 years ago, was still part of an apartheid government. So there was apartheid in South Africa, and we had our first democratically elected president in 1994. So this year is literally 30 years since we've had a democracy in South Africa. And so at the time, apartheid was essentially a system of segregation where white people were on one side, black people were not allowed to be, and people of color were not allowed to be in certain spaces that they were at. And so Black Sash has its origin. In fact, it was founded by a few white women who saw the injustice that was happening with apartheid. But they thought to themselves, what can we do? So instead of so they sort of got together and they started to do activism work, but really slowly. So a lot of them, their husbands were politicians, lawyers. They were actively participating in this oppressive government. And as a result, they were not allowed to be these activists on the side. So what it came to be is that every time they would do something or want to protest, they would wear a black sash. If you would imagine like Miss Universe, the sash, but it's black and it was a sign of protest. So every time you'd see this group of women, whether it was outside the court, when political prisoners were being detained, or whether it was after a massacre killing, they would quietly stand on the side of the road wearing the sash, and everybody would know that that was a protest happening. So essentially, we've got our roots back in that. We were founded in 1955. So next year, we're going to be 70 years old. And yeah, so essentially, that's our history. That's our
Oh,
history.
that is amazing, and I think it's a true testament of how much we can actually change just by showing people that we are against certain ideas, against certain uh, principles. Let's call it, yeah. But thinking of what has changed, because it's been a long, long road, especially when we think about social advancements in South Africa. A lot has changed. I know that globally, I think we still have a lot of ground to conquer. But what would be like the most pressing issues or maybe the challenges that you guys are fighting in South Africa right now? What are you seeing?
Sure. So, when we first had our first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela, Black Sash as an organization thought, you know what? We've done it. We've fought the oppressive government. We've gone into democracy. Now we can, should we maybe take a pause? But what we then started to realize is that when this democratic government came into place, a big part of what the work that was needed to do was essentially making sure that people are looked after. People had been oppressed for a very long time, and we needed to get to some place where there's a little bit of not equality, but equity. People needed to sort of start recovering. So for example, people were not allowed. Black people were not allowed to be at certain universities. They were not allowed to pursue certain careers. So how do we make that right? And so essentially, Black Sash sort of started in the work of, well, so the social justice space. How do we support this newly elected government in making sure that, we get to where we need to get as a country and as a community? In time, unfortunately, what's happened is that 30 years down the line, we've realized that we've the rich have gotten richer, the middle class has gotten rich, but there's been a large group that's been left behind in dire straits of poverty. So maybe for a little bit of context, South Africa has a 46% youth unemployment rate. So 46% of young people are unemployed. over the 37 odd percent, I want to say, that is generally employed. So when you see that the high levels of hunger, the high levels of crime as a consequence, and we're not talking about young people that, were just on the streets. We're talking graduates. We have doctors who, don't have jobs. And so in an economy like that, the other side of that is that we've got this amazing constitution because our constitution only came into being 94. We took the best pieces of the constitutions around the world. And now that's why South Africa has one of the best constitutions in the world. It offers all these social protection rights. But what we found is that what is promised in the constitution and what's happening on the ground is completely different. And so essentially that's where our work comes in, to fill in those gaps and just see making sure that people are held to account for the promises that people were made.
Well, and I love that you bring this aspect of the Constitution because it really shows something about how the society is organized, right? And seeing
Yeah.
this disparities, it's necessary for us to be able to move
Yeah.
forward, honestly. So thanks for bringing this, Rachel. And considering all of these issues, and I'm kind of astonished with the number that you brought us. It must be, wow, it must
Yeah.
like take a high dose of hope to, keep moving forward sometimes. But how are you able to like prioritize the focus areas that you work on? Because you are trying to tackle social security, healthcare, um, probably gender questions as well. So that's one thing first. How do you decide where to focus on? And second, what are you guys doing in there to change all of these things?
Yeah. Sure. So South Africa, we've got a really robust civil society, like a nonprofit sector where, the constant fight is on essentially. So as Black Sash, we have honed in on the right to social assistance. So our constitution provides that you actually, if you're destitute, you've got no job, you've got no family, like you're basically destitute, you've got a right to this. And what we've seen is that the right is there, but it's implemented really badly. So we focused particularly on access to grants. So, for example, when people of an old age receive grants, they would receive social assistance or whatever it be. One of the things we've realized is, though that system works, and I say that quote unquote, we've got our scenarios of implementation are different. So an old person is expected to walk really far distances to get this grant. And when they get there, there are these long queues, there are no bathrooms, there are no chairs. And you're talking about an 80-year-old, a 90-year-old who spends 6 hours, 7 hours in this queue. When you get to the front of the queue, they say, oh, we've run out of money. So the right is there, but the implementation of it is problematic. So we've honed in on that. And one of the things we specialize in doing is community-based monitoring. It's essentially where we empower smaller NGOs and nonprofits around us as our partners, and we send them into the communities, the most rural parts of South Africa, urban parts of South Africa, peri-urban parts, and they monitor what it is like when people have to receive these grants and what that process is. And So if you can imagine that old people are taken care of and children are taken care of, then you've got this entire section of 18 to 59-year-olds where there's no social protection for them. If you are 18 to 59 and you're destitute, well, you're in trouble. And so it's essentially the move for that there should be a basic income grant to support people like that.
Wow, I'm putting all the pieces together here and thinking, especially in the bit that you said, how robust this social, the sorry, I forgot the word I was going to, civil
Civil
society.
society,
Yes,
yes.
thank you. How robust the civil societies are in South Africa, and to be able to look at this, let's say this gap, right? It's
Yeah.
something else. But then, how does it work? Like you probably are making like partnerships with other organizations as well, I would think. Or maybe
Sure.
do you actually add international organizations to it? How it all comes together?
Sure. So perhaps let me explain the model. So just in the arms of social assistance, that just that issue alone, the way it works is that we work with partners on the ground. We bring them in, we train them in terms of how to gather information on the ground, because we need to be able. What matters to us is not what the wealthy or the middle person says. It's about what their lived experiences are. So we've got people across the country, the entire country, who take this data on and we put it into a report, we produce reports that these are the lived experiences. This is what is happening on the ground. So if you can imagine it like a three-tiered approach, so then that data, then we go to municipality level, region by region, starting to engage with those politicians. How do we make changes? How do we do this? So, for example, a couple of changes we made initially, non-South Africa, in order to apply for a grant, you needed a 13-digit ID number. But non-South Africans didn't receive that, right? So even if you qualified, you couldn't get. So that online system had to be changed. Things like when they put things online, for example, but people necessarily do not have the technical skills to be able to apply for it online, being able to get offices and support and that kind of thing, or the kind of changes we make in terms of at that policy level, putting pressure around things like chairs, bathroom, that's that middle level. And then my level, what I work at with other team members, is the big policy level, with your ministers, with your presidents, etc. Because I think the big thing is there has to be policy change. As a country, we have to see that the levels of poverty and unemployment are really problematic, and something needs to be done. And then, if I can say, immediately when people hear us talk about, people need to be given social assistance, people are like, well, what we need is jobs. We agree. We're in complete agreement. People need to be given jobs so that they do not rely on the state. We absolutely support that. But you have to remember the context in which we're having this conversation. We're not talking about a country that has jobs available for young people and they're deciding to stay home. We're talking about a context where almost half of them, despite having some form of tertiary education after high school, are at home, And so that context matters. So if I could say that's one arm of the work. But in time, we've started to see that countries with similar economies with South Africa have been able to offer what we call a social protection floor. So if you could imagine grants as one arm of it, but basically that if you're destitute, you can access healthcare, you can access housing, children can access nutrition. This idea of a safety net that essentially catches you. And so that's the line of work we've started to push into. If countries with a little bit less than South Africa can do it for their people, I think we need to get the political will to move to get it done for ours as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think this is how you drive the actual societal change, right? And it's through demanding rights and changing policies. And again, if other countries are having successful experiences with it, what is preventing South Africa to have the same, So it's a really good way to start thinking, at least. And thank you for explaining it, Rachel. I think it was very much clear now how things go through and get to you and how you're able to move the wheel forward. I'm going to tell people right now to go to your page before we move to the second bit of the interview, because I think there's like a lot of information they can get, and especially different ways they can get in touch with you. The webpage is blacksash, all together, .org.za. Again, I tell you guys, go there, check the page, and there is so much to learn through what you're explaining there. I think it was actually quite beautiful web page, I gotta say. My designer bit kind of likes it. Now, I presume, Rachel, that all of this movement that you guys were able to do for so long has come with challenges. It's not easy to change society, and I cannot see it happening without overcoming obstacles. So maybe we don't need to really go historical about it, but on the recent years, what do you see that were like the hardest things to overcome, or are still challenges that you're trying to get through?
Sure. I've got about two that I actually want to talk about. The first one is, it's hard to move political will. When politicians, make decisions that aren't done through a human rights lens. And what we've been able to do to sort of overcome that is use our court systems. So one of the difficulties with my job is that I have to be friendly enough with politicians to be in the room with them, yet simultaneously we take them to court. So it's constantly balancing that relationship and being at the table. That is the first one. But I think the bigger problem, and it's not at the politician level, it's at everyone level, and I'm sure even some of our viewers, it is easy to dissociate from poverty and struggle because we've heard it so much, we've become desensitized. It doesn't matter anymore. But the difference here is that we're talking about something that can happen to anyone, where suddenly your support structure disappears and you're in need of that social assistance net, that social protection flow to be caught, even if it's just for a couple of months until you get on your feet. So I think it's important that um, our privilege, as whether it's the middle class, lower middle class, our privilege doesn't blind us to the fact that these struggles are real. Because it's when every single person thinks, oh, that's someone else's problem, that it's an issue. Because even when we talk about political will and moving the needle, if the masses, the people on the ground are saying, actually, this is a problem, it's not normal for a society to have these levels of unemployment rate. It's not normal for people to go to sleep hungry, all these kinds of things. Then I think we'll start to see the needle move. One of the things we've done to sort of overcome that, poverty fatigue essentially from people is that on our YouTube page, we've created 2-minute long stories of people's lived experiences. These are not actors. These are people that these are their circumstances in 2 minutes. You just tell us what your setting is like. And I think it's important for people to just tap into that once in a while so that even if it's not here, but in your own surroundings, you just remember that yeah, you can do something around where you are. Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
it's that.
No, absolutely. I think you go to a point that it's paramount if you want to talk, really address the issues, because sometimes, even though it's not a reality that we live on, that we have to face on, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So the more there's stay blindsided to it, the less we're gonna change. So it's absolutely. And now looking at this again, these challenges in the social economic arena, let's say, and thinking of the goals that you have as an organization, right? The goals that Black Sash has. Uh, where do you guys are going? What are you planning, or what is your vision for the future, especially, and how do they align, with these needs and the rights in South Africa?
Sure. Yeah, a big goal, and it's part of our rights education work, which I didn't talk about, but I mentioned earlier, we've got this amazing constitution, but the people struggling don't know they've got all these rights. So a big part of our work is educating. You've actually got the right to this. Nobody's doing you a favor. I mean, we see it. We are currently, South Africa's in an election year. I mean, we've heard reports of, people saying to them, well, if you don't vote for us, your check goes away. It's just the manipulation that needs to be stopped in the sense that, and the only way we overcome that is with education. So a lot of our rights education work is ideally is that every person knows their right that they have, and that by receiving, a grant or by receiving free healthcare, if that's what the social protection flow eventually leads to, no one's doing you a favor. You don't have to bend yourself into a pretzel. It's your actual right. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that I think as a country, we are far enough and economically in a place where the idea of the safety net, the social protection flow, should be in public discourse. We're not saying immediately implement it because I know it's going to take time, but it should be public discourse where people think, well, actually, with all these rights, if I'm in trouble, I should be able to rely on my states to be able to do that. So it's essentially making sure that this conversation starts to happen. This conversation is had with people. And ideally, of course, the last thing is supporting wherever, as a country, as individuals, whatever might be needed to make sure that people are able to live a dignified life. Danny, one of my pet peeves, if I may say, is this idea because we get a lot of, people just want free money, they stay at home. But the problem with that scenario is that you assume that common sense and logic does not apply to someone because they're poor. Because if it was you, if it was me, we were offered the equivalent of 15 US dollars a month or a job that gives you a salary, you would take the job and the salary. Why do we assume that because people are poor, they would deliberately stay home and take the $15 a month? And so for me, it's also just that place of privilege that we're hoping to sort of get people moving away from. Definitely.
Absolutely. I think once again you strike the nerve, the right nerve, Rachel. We have very similar discussions here in Brazil, and especially navigating these ideas, right? Of, oh, how assistentialist the government is being. And okay, I understand that we need to have this healthy discussions in terms of, is it too much? Is it too many? Is it
Absolutely.
too little? We need to understand where things are. But to make this sort of assumptions, it's actually a damage to any kind of future that we're trying to build. So come on, it serves no
Yeah.
purpose on my perspective. So yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things we've said in the conversations with politicians, at least in my corner of the work, not the groundwork. We've said to them, the argument is always, we can't afford it. It's going to destroy the country. We've said that's okay. We work with other civil society partners who've done the financial models. Hear us out. See how we propose that this is afforded, and bring your economists. If they say we're completely wrong and we've completely missed a boat, that's fine. But hear out the proposals that's on the table. And there's no willingness to do that. So then, Danny, you'd ask yourself, why would you not want to listen if there's a possibility of how this can be afforded? So all this to say that it's a will thing. It's, I don't believe the poor should be looked after, and as a consequence, we're not going to do this. And I just think all of us in our own spaces is to just watch our own privileges. I mean, I make sure that I'm always, you know, watch my own privilege as well when we're on the field. I mean, when it finishes, we get in our cars, we go home. People that we leave behind do not. And so being sure that we're constantly watching for that.
Yeah, I think every day more, I'm starting to think that the question sometimes is not exactly the privilege that we have, but what we decide to do with the privilege that we have. So it needs
Absolutely.
to be, we need to see the shift, see? And thinking about all of this and considering the privileges that our listeners might have right now, I think one vital questions to ask here is, how can people get involved and help you guys keep moving forward, keep advancing on these changes?
Sure. I think the first thing that would be really good is to just go through our social medias, give us a follow, help spread the message in your spaces. Because remember, what we're asking for is not something that is foreign to other countries. It is standard practice, and for some reason in our country it's not standard practice. So if we can have just the voice of support from people in other spaces saying that actually this is not an unreasonable ask, would be a good thing. And then if people are able to donate financially to some of the pieces of the work, whatever it be, that is always also really really helpful for us to have.
Absolutely. And again, people go to their page and then you can get in touch, you can understand more, and then you can help out definitely more. All right. Rachel, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. This was really a great talk today.
Thank you so much for having me, Danny. Really appreciate
It was a pleasure. And to everyone listening or watching us on YouTube, thank you so much for staying with us for this more episode. And remember, if you liked it, press subscribe on YouTube or in a podcast app. Share this episode with your friends, with your family, with everyone that you think can relate or can get engaged with this cause, because this helps us show the algorithm that this is an important conversation, and then more people can learn about the importance of Black Sash. All right, bye. Check their page, and I see you in the next episode.